What a typical day looked like in the 1960s. Britain. The 1960s in Britain was a decade of dramatic change. It was a time when old traditions brushed shoulders with new freedoms, when televisions flickered in black and white before bursting into color, and when teenagers carved out their own identity in music, fashion, and lifestyle. But what about the everyday? Beyond the headlines, the glamour of the swinging 60s, and the iconic music scene, life carried on with routines that shaped ordinary families. Let's step back in time and see what a typical day looked like in 1960s Britain. Morning routine in 1960s. Britain? Mornings in the 1960s. Britain often began with the whistle of a kettle. Tea was the nation's lifeblood, though instant coffee was quickly gaining popularity thanks to brands like Nescafé, which had firmly arrived in British homes by the early 1960s. Breakfast was simple but hearty. Working-class families relied on toast with butter and jam, boiled eggs, or porridge, while the occasional fry-up was reserved for weekends. Breakfast cereals were becoming more common. Kellogg's Corn Flakes and Rice Krispies lined kitchen cupboards, especially in middle-class households that welcomed convenience. Cold mornings were part of daily life. Central heating was still rare. By 1960, only about 5% of households had it. So most relied on coal fires or paraffin heaters. Children woke to frosty windows and the smoky tang of coal in the air. Bathrooms were basic, and in larger families it was not unusual to share bathwater. In 1961, only around a third of homes had refrigerators. Freezers were still a luxury, meaning food shopping happened more frequently. All these details paint a picture of modest but resourceful life in 1960s Britain. Getting to school or work. The morning rush looked very different from today. Car ownership was rising fast, but not yet universal. In 1961, just 38% of households owned a car. By 1971, more than half did. Cars like the Ford Anglia, the Morris Minor, and the newly iconic Mini, launched in 1959, were common sights on British streets. Many still relied on public transport. Double-decker buses groaned under the weight of rush-hour crowds, while trains ferried office workers into cities. School children often walked or cycled, dressed neatly in uniform, as school buses were not yet widespread outside rural areas. Office workers left home in suits, ties, and polished shoes. Women, entering the workforce in greater numbers, wore skirts and blouses. Industrial workers filled shipyards, car plants, and construction sites, usually carrying packed lunches in metal tins. Mothers staying at home often began their day by visiting the butcher, baker, or greengrocer, as supermarkets were only just beginning to spread. The daily commute was a snapshot of a society straddling old traditions and new modernity in 1960s UK daily life. At school in the 1960s UK, schools in the 1960s. Britain were strict and formal. Classrooms were dominated by wooden desks in neat rows, with blackboards and chalk as the main teaching tools. Teachers often enforced discipline with corporal punishment. Caning or ruler slaps, accepted practice at the time. The focus was on the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Lessons also included grammar, history, and geography. Science labs were basic, and technology was minimal compared to modern classrooms. One of the most vivid memories for children was school milk. Introduced after the Second World War, every child received a small glass bottle of milk each morning, sealed with a foil top. School dinners were hearty and filling: roast meat with potatoes, thick gravy, and puddings like jam roly-poly or spotted dick. Uniforms were standard and rules were firm, but schools instilled a sense of respect and discipline. These routines showed just how central education was to everyday life in the 1960s Britain. Work life in 1960s Britain. Workplaces reflected a mix of tradition and change. Offices echoed with the clatter of typewriters, the shuffle of paperwork, and the haze of cigarette smoke. Filing cabinets lined walls, and dictation to secretaries was standard practice. Computers existed only in large corporations and government offices. Tea breaks were a ritual. Many offices had tea trolleys, and workers gathered for a quick chat, biscuits in hand. For industrial workers, jobs in factories, coal mines, and steelworks were the backbone of the economy. Pay packets came in small brown envelopes every Friday, long before electronic bank transfers became common. By the mid-1960s, Britain's car industry was thriving, with Birmingham and Coventry at the heart of production. Shipbuilding flourished in Glasgow and Newcastle, while coal mining still powered much of the country. Women, making up about 35% of the workforce in 1961, found roles in offices, shops, and hospitals, marking a gradual shift in gender roles. Work life was steady, defined by loyalty to one's job and the strength of trade unions. It was the foundation of 1960s UK working-class life. Lunch and midday in the 1960s UK. By midday, Britain paused for a meal. In offices, sandwiches or pies were common, and many men headed to the local pub for a pint before returning to work, a routine normalized in the culture of the time. At home, women often prepared lunches with ingredients from local shops. Though supermarkets had begun to spread after the first opened in 1951, corner shops still dominated. Tesco and Sainsbury's were just starting their march across the high streets. Meals were straightforward: ham sandwiches, soup, or meat pies. Children at school sat down to hot, subsidized dinners, while homemakers enjoyed tea and conversation with friends. Midday meals reflected a balance of old habits and new convenience, marking how food culture was evolving in 1960s Britain. Evenings at home. Evenings were family time. After work or school, households gathered for the main meal, often called tea in working-class homes. Shepherd's pie, sausages with mash, or fish and chips on a Friday were staples. Television was quickly becoming the household centerpiece. By 1961, about 75% of homes owned a set, and in 1967, BBC Two began the first color broadcasts. Families huddled around. Shows like Coronation Street, launched in 1960, Doctor Who, 1963, or Top of the Pops, 1964. Radio remained powerful too, with pirate stations such as Radio Caroline, 1964, broadcasting rock and pop beyond the BBC's limits, thrilling young listeners. Parents often spent evenings with newspapers, knitting, or wireless sets, while children did homework. This mix of tradition and modern entertainment reveals how technology reshaped daily life in 1960s Britain. Youth and leisure in 1960s Britain. The real story of the 1960s belonged to its young people. Teenagers no longer dressed like their parents. They had their own style, their own music, and their own culture. The mods, clad in sharp Italian suits, rode scooters and worshipped The Who. Their rivals, the rockers, preferred leather jackets, motorbikes, and Elvis Presley. Meanwhile, young women embraced Mary Quant's miniskirt, introduced in 1965, bold eyeliner, and daring hairstyles. Music was the heartbeat. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Dusty Springfield, and the Kinks dominated charts, while record shops and dance halls thrived. Coffee bars and cinemas became teenage meeting spots, offering freedom from parental eyes. Youth culture symbolized rebellion, individuality, and optimism, marking a cultural revolution. It was this younger generation that transformed the image of life in 1960s Britain on the world stage. Nighttime in the 1960s, UK. As night fell, Britain quieted down. Pubs, restricted by licensing laws introduced in 1915, closed around 10:30 or 11 p.m. Couples might head to the cinema, though audiences were shrinking as TVS spread into living rooms. Still, James Bond films, Dr. No in 1962, and Beatles movies drew massive crowds. At home, families wound down with a final cup of tea, a crossword, or a book. Many bedrooms were shared, especially by siblings, and without central heating, heavy blankets were the norm. Streets fell silent, and nightlife was modest compared to today's 24-hour cities. This slower pace of evenings captured the simplicity and rhythm of everyday life in 1960s Britain. A typical day in 1960s Britain was a blend of tradition and transformation. From coal fires and corner shops to the rise of supermarkets, from brown pay packets to the dawn of color television, and from strict schools to teenage revolutions, the decade reshaped how families lived. Looking back, it feels both familiar and foreign, a reminder of how much has changed, yet how much remains at the heart of British life. Thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell.